Welcome to this presentation, which will be covering Chapter 4, the chapter that discusses the topic of consideration, the value for the promise. We're going to cover the first half of this chapter in this lecture and then cover the second half in a second lecture. So let's get started. You have seen this slide before, so we're going to visit it one more time to see how we're making progress. In chapter 3, we covered the topic of offer and acceptance. And in chapter 5, we talked about the topic of mutual assent. All three of these things are necessary in order to have an agreement. And we need to have an agreement in order to have a contract. So we would say that an agreement is an element of a contract. But we actually have several other elements that we need to think about in order to have a contract. If we're missing any one of the elements, then we don't have a contract. So we have consideration. Consideration is our second element, and that's the topic of this chapter. We also have legal capacity, and we have legal object as our fourth and final element. We have a fifth thing that is sometimes required, but because the word is sometimes, we don't consider it an element. It's a nice thing if you've got it, but you don't have to have it. Now, we have these items, but these items here are not elements of contract. They are elements of an agreement. So this offer is required in order to have an agreement. If I don't have an offer, I don't have an agreement. If I don't have an agreement, I don't have a contract. If I have an offer but I don't have an acceptance, I don't have an agreement, and therefore I don't have a contract. If I have an offer and acceptance but somehow there isn't mutual assent, then I don't have an agreement, and I don't have a contract. Similarly, if I don't have consideration, but I have an agreement with all the parts, and I have legal capacity, and I have a legal object, I do not have a contract. I have to have this in order to have a contract. So let's talk in more detail about consideration. Here is a schema. You'll see much of, or actually all of this information and more information in the module that covers consideration. What I've done is I had more granularity up here, and I didn't add that so it all fit on one side. But this is the red part is what we're going to be focusing on today, consideration. We're going to talk about the 5 characteristics of consideration, that it has to either be a detriment or a benefit, that it has to be a bargain for exchange between the parties, that it has to involve something of value, at least something of value to the parties, and there has to be a promise between the parties, and whatever of value is being exchanged has to be legal. These are the elements of consideration. So we have our 4 elements of contract. We've got agreement, consideration, legal capacity, and legal object. But again, our focus today is on this topic. So let's continue. This is our definition for consideration. I always am frustrated by this definition. I don't really think it adds a lot of extra light to the issue of consideration. I guess because consideration is such a basic concept, it's difficult to find. It's a little bit like defining the word is. If you look up the word is in the dictionary, I'm sure there's a definition for it. But the problem is, if you don't know what the word is means in English, the definition is not going to help you one little bit, because that's such a simple building block part of the English language. You're not going to really be able to understand something, an English language definition for is, if you don't understand what the word is means. And that's kind of similar to what consideration is. But let's look at the definition just so we say we have done so. And again, this term is in red and it's in bold, so it is a definitional term. You will very likely see this definition on a quiz or a test going forward. So what is consideration? That which is given in exchange for the performance of the promise to perform. The price bargained for and paid, the inducement. These are all good definitions. They're kind of synonyms for the same idea. Another way that I like to think about that might be a little bit more accessible is tit for tat. I do A because you're going to do B. It's a back and forth type thing. It's bargained for. It's what the 2 parties are in it for. It's a reason they're entering into the contract to begin with. Now, one of the problems with the term consideration is that it has another meaning, and it's the word that you and I use all the time. We're having a disagreement with someone. We might say, please show me some consideration, Or, gosh, that waiter was very rude. He didn't show me any consideration. Now, when we use the term in that way, we mean something very different than this definition. And I happen to have copied the definition from the dictionary. What is consideration? The ordinary meaning? Careful thought, the act of thinking carefully about something you will make a decision about, a desire to avoid doing something that will make another person sad, upset, angry, etc. This is what we usually mean, but you can see it's pretty darn different than this definition. Even though the words look alike, and from a historical perspective, there's definitely some connections, I think it's best to just kind of separate them intellectually in your head and recognize when we use the word consideration in contract class, it doesn't mean this. So just forget about this term. Be considerate of the other students in the class, but don't confuse that word with this word up here. There's a little quote here. I like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh says this in one of the books or the little TV shows. A little consideration, a little thought for others makes all the difference. Well, in a way, this works for contracts because we definitely need some consideration in order to have a contract, and it can be just a little bit. So Eeyore might have been a paralegal in another life. And so that's a useful thing to think about, this little quote here, because a little consideration does make all the difference in contract law. Okay, so let's consider some issues before we get to the elements of contract, elements of consideration. Let's talk about kind of the nature of consideration, what it is and what it isn't. Because a definition to me is a lot of times more unwieldy to deal with. It's kind of more practical for me to eliminate things and put things in the bucket and say, this fits, this doesn't fit. The first thing to keep in mind is consideration doesn't have to be money. I'll be honest with you, most contracts involve money. A lot of times it's a service in exchange for money, or an item in exchange for money. Usually one of the parties to a contract is giving money and the other party is giving something else, but that is by no means a requirement. For example, let's say that I am painting your barn. You might agree that if I paint your barn, you will give me your car. That would be consideration. But my painting of the barn doesn't involve money, and you're giving me your car doesn't involve money. So while it's usual for money to be involved, by no means is a requirement. Another thing about consideration is that value is whatever the parties think it is. I happen to have tremendously talented children. They're older now, but when they were little, they would finger paint and draw and do all kinds of things. And even though they really didn't stay in the lines and they chose interesting colors for their characters, I thought they revealed a great and deep talent. And so did my mother and my husband's mother. All three of us were in complete agreement that these children were tremendously talented. And while I did not sell the paintings to my mother and my mother-in-law, they would have been glad to pay for them because they saw real value. But my guess is that you, who do not know the little angels that are my children, might look at the paintings, and because you are not an art scholar, might not immediately recognize the deep and abiding artistic merit of these paintings. You might, in fact, look at these paintings and think, that would work at the bottom of my bird's cage, or at the bottom of my cat's litter box. Maybe that's where it would belong. You might see no value in it. So therefore, if I entered into a contract with you, my beautiful children's beautiful artwork would not be considered consideration by you. But if I were entering into a contract with my mother-in-law or my mother, why, yes, they would absolutely see consideration in the value that those paintings have. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, guess what? Consideration's value is in the eye of the beholder. We see value. It can be a very subjective thing. Now, I know I've said in previous classes, we've talked about objective versus subjective. We talked about the reasonable person. But this is one area that we do have some subjectivity, because my mother and mother-in-law see beauty in these pictures, but probably 99% of the world would not see the beauty. So they are having a subjective experience. And guess what? That's enough to make it valuable. Is it valuable to them? Not valuable generally, not valuable objectively, but is it valuable subjectively? So we're actually applying a subjective standard to this consideration issue. But let's assume for a second that this item has value. We'll say it's my child's finger painting. Well, the fact that it has some value is all we need. We don't need a lot of value. I said before that you might look upon my child's artwork and say, gosh, they're not that good. But you know what? Even so, the paper has value. I mean, let's assume for a second that they only finger painted on one side of the paper. Well, you could turn over the paper and use the other side to take notes in class. Or you might use the paper to start a campfire, use it as kindling or something like that. So even though it doesn't have very much value at all to you, it has slightly more than zero value. Well, guess what? That's all we need. So even though you think my children have no artistic ability, it would still have a little bit of value to you, and so therefore would still be considered consideration. Now, of course, my mother and mother-in-law would think it has significant value. But you know what? The courts don't really care whether the parties think it has just a little bit of value or a lot of value. The only important thing is, does it have any value at all? Okay, so the amount is not important. It's kind of like an on-off switch. This is not a situation where you have a dimmer switch where you can have the mood light really low or very bright. The light's on 100% or it's off 0%. There's no gradients here. And let's look at the final aspect for the nature of consideration. The existence of consideration proves that the parties intend to be bound by an enforceable contract. This is really important. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this because this is a little bit more of theory. This is kind of behind the scenes. What are judges thinking about when they think about consideration? This is the behind the scenes look at it. Kind of if you're the Wizard of Oz, this is where we're behind the scenes pulling the levers and all that kind of stuff. Imagine for a second that that my mother is a famous art collector, and she has Picassos and Chagalls and Monets and all kinds of really amazing artwork. And she comes to me, she goes, daughter of mine, I see that your beautiful children have done some finger painting, and I would like to sell this beautiful Monet painting to you for one finger painting of your son Adam and one finger painting of your daughter Mary. And then we'll do a swap. You'll get the Monet, I'll get the two finger paintings. Now we would all say, lady, you're crazy, because Monet paintings are worth millions of dollars. Finger painting by little kids who are not maybe the absolute best at art are worth basically almost zilch, right? So that's a really stupid thing for my mom to agree to. But you know what? The courts don't care. The courts would not care. They would not bat an eye. They don't care that the consideration is wildly out of bounds, and this is why they don't care. Their job, or at least what they see as their job, is not trying to see if the deal was fair or smart or reasonable. Because they look upon the parties to the contract as adults. They say, you know what? You can make a stupid decision if you want to, because guess what? You're an adult. I mean, people make stupid decisions all the time. They marry the wrong people. They take the wrong job. They make bad financial decisions. I mean, people make stupid decisions every single day. And guess what? Nobody comes along and plays nanny and says, now, wait a second. You really shouldn't marry that person. No, guess what? If Bob wants to marry Susan and Susan wants to marry Bob, and they're both single and they're both over the age of 21, guess what? They're going to be allowed to marry, even if everybody says that's a really bad idea, right? They get to make stupid decisions. And the courts have the same philosophy about contracts. Guess what? Grandma gets to make a stupid decision and sell her Monet for these finger painting projects. So you may be thinking, well, gosh, if the courts don't really care whether it's a fair contract, why do they require consideration at all? This is why, this bullet right here. The existence of the consideration is the signal to the court that the parties meant to enter into a contract. That's when kind of the rubber hits the road. You know, if my mom had instead said to me, you know what, my daughter of mine, I want to give you this Monet. And, you know, she said it in passing one day. And then a few weeks later, I say to her, well, hey, Mom, I'm ready to take that Monet off your hands. And she says to me, you know what? I mean, at some point I'll give it to you, but I plan on being around for 20, 30 more years. So, you know, I mean, eventually you'll get it, but, you know, not today, not anytime soon. Well, then I sue her about it. Well, we had a contract. You said you were going to give it to me, and I want it now. Well, the court would say, but Groover, you weren't contributing anything to this transaction, not even anything symbolic like your children's artwork. So this was really a gift more than um, a contract. And your mom has a right to change her mind about a gift until she gives it. And so there is no contract. And a lot of times people say stuff, maybe they're not being real careful with their words. And so there may be what my mom really meant was, I'm thinking about doing this, or I'm probably going to do this, or I'm feeling really generous right now, so I'm going to say this, but I might not feel so generous later on, and I might not intend to do it at some future date. I don't want to feel like I'm committed at this point. But you know, when we start talking about consideration and when both parties are contributing something, that's when people start realizing, oh, wait a second. I kind of am going to have to do whatever I'm about to say I'm going to do. I'm going to be stuck with it. So before I say something now, let me pause and see, do I really want to do this? It's kind of the wake-up call. It's kind of the moment where you're like, oh yeah, this is for real. This isn't just blowing smoke. This is for real. The consideration is what tells us in our head and tells the court, oh yeah, these parties were making a contract. And they understood what a contract was, and they understood they were going to have to do what they said they were going to do. This is the part of the contract that kind of serves that role of a wake-up call. Hey, you know what? We're contracting here. This isn't just a gift. This isn't just talk. This is for real. So now we have our 5 elements of contract. We've already seen these elements over here. They're the same elements that we have on this list. And we've already talked about these to a fair degree already. But we're going to drill down for the rest of this presentation and talk about these 5 elements of a contract. And these, you could look at these as elements, or you could see these as a definition. However makes more sense to you. But the first thing that we have, our first element, is that in order for something to be consideration, it has to either be a detriment or a benefit. And as a practical matter, it's probably going to be both. A detriment or benefit. And we have 2 definitions here. So we have the red here, detriment and benefit. And you know what? While I provide these definitions from the textbook for the most part, you know what these are. I mean, detriment is a word that, you know, we know just in general life. Unlike the word consideration, detriment means the same thing basically in the legal area as it would in everyday conversation. What is a detriment? It's undertaking some responsibility one is not legally bound to undertake. I apologize for the typo. Or in refraining from exercising some right one would otherwise have been entitled to exercise. And I added this, a sacrifice by a party. And we have kind of 2 categories here that detriment can fall into. One is doing an action that we didn't have to do. The other is refraining from something we could have done, but we didn't. What we're saying we're not going to do. That's a detriment. Most of the time when we're looking at a detriment, we're looking at it from the perspective of the person who's promising to do something. It's going to be a detriment to them. So when my mom is saying, I'm going to give up the Monet painting, that's her detriment. She's not going to have the painting anymore. She is acting by surrendering that painting to me in a way that she is not required by law to do so. She doesn't have to give it to me. She can keep it if she wants to. Let's imagine a different scenario. Let's say that my mother is concerned that I'm chewing too much bubble gum. And she goes, you know what, daughter of mine, I am really unhappy with how much bubble gum you're chewing. And so therefore, what I'm going to tell you is if you don't chew bubble gum for the next 30 days, I will give you this priceless Monet. So her detriment is that she's acting in a way not required by law. She's making a sacrifice. She's giving up the Monet. But if I agree to this, am also experiencing a detriment. I am refraining from exercising a legal right. I'm legally entitled to chew bubble gum, and I am saying I am not going to chew bubble gum for 30 days. Now, you might say that's kind of a silly thing to give up, but guess what? For a priceless Monet, I would be willing to give up bubble gum and quite a few other things. So that's how a detriment works. I could have done something, or I could have not done something, and I'm choosing the opposite action. I am committing to a path. Now, the detriment can be really, really simple. I'll give you an example. I don't chew bubble gum. I mean, it's been years since I've chewed bubble gum. So for me to agree to say I'm not going to chew bubble gum for the next 30 days, I mean, honestly, I almost certainly wouldn't have chewed bubble gum anyway, but there is a difference. Before I made that promise to my mom, I could have chewed bubble gum. I could have gone to the CVS and picked up a bubble gum, and maybe I would have. Maybe that idea would have just struck me. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds good. But now that I've entered into the contract, while I legally can, I mean, it's not a crime for me to, I would be in breach of the contract. And so even though it's unlikely I ever would have taken a piece of bubble gum and put it in my mouth during those 30 days, because I now can't and comply with the contract, that is considered a detriment to me. So again, we're talking about sometimes a very, very small, almost theoretical detriment. But again, we're not going to be looking at the amount of consideration. That's not relevant. So let's look at benefits. Benefits probably even a more ready word in our vocabulary. It's also in red and also in bold, so you are responsible for knowing it. Anything that adds to the advantage or security of another. Typically in the area of consideration, if it's a detriment to the person making the promise, it's presumably going to be a benefit to the other party. If my mother is giving up her Monet and giving it to me, that's a benefit to me because I didn't have that Monet before and now I do. If I agree not to chew bubble gum, that's a detriment to me, but presumably it's a benefit to my mom. Maybe she's worried about my dental health or something along those lines. She is not going to have to worry about maybe me disgracing the family by chewing gum or developing dental decay or something along those lines. That could be a benefit to her. Those are examples. It doesn't have to be both a detriment and a benefit, but in most cases it will be both. It only has to be one, so it's a detriment or a benefit. So let's consider an example here. We have, again, little Bobby and little Sally. We have the same scenario we've seen before where Bobby is trying to sell his frog to Sally. Okay, so of course, Bobby thinks his frog is the bee's knees, it's awesome and wonderful and tremendous, but he's willing to give it up. This is a detriment to Bobby. In a perfect world, he'd like to be able to keep his frog, but he needs some cash. If this girl agrees to the contract, then she's getting a benefit. Bobby's getting a detriment, no more frog. Sally's getting a benefit. She has a frog where she didn't used to. Now we can see in this picture, she doesn't seem too happy. She keeps on raising her arms. So she, in this example, might not see it as a benefit, but if she's going to enter into the contract, she almost certainly does, because otherwise, why would she? So if A suffers a detriment, if Bobby has a detriment because he doesn't have the frog, then A has provided consideration. But let's assume for a second that Bobby really wants to get rid of the frog. His mom has already told him, no more frog here. And so he really isn't going to be able to keep the frog. And it's just taking up too much of his time anyway. He really just wants the frog whole thing over with. So he really doesn't see it as a detriment. But let's say Sally is thrilled or even just mildly pleased to get a frog. So Bobby doesn't have a detriment, but Sally gets a benefit. Well, under that scenario, Bobby has also provided consideration. So it can be one or the other, or it can be both. This is a picture of some peppercorns blown up super big. This is the classic example of consideration. If you think about peppercorns, obviously they're usually more like the maybe this size in real life. You put them in a pepper mill and you grind it up and you sprinkle it on your food. And fancy restaurants, they'll have a huge pepper mill that comes around and puts pepper on your food sometimes. Anyway, each one of those grains of pepper are worth significantly less than 1 penny. It used to be that sometimes contracts would say that the consideration being provided is a peppercorn. And you might say, gosh, a peppercorn, I mean, gosh, that's not even worth a penny. Surely that's not consideration. Plus, I mean, did really anyone want a peppercorn? I mean, that seems like a silly thing to enter into a contract over. Well, actually, even though it has value less than a penny, it is still consideration because, it has some value. I mean, if you had, say, 100 peppercorns, that might be worth 5 cents. If you had 1,000,000 peppercorns, that'd be worth, some money, right? So even though it's very, very small value, it does have some. And so we don't say how much value it has. We ask, does it have value? So that's our first topic. We've figured out that in order for it to be consideration, there has to be a detriment or a benefit. A detriment to the person making the promise, or a benefit to the person receiving the promise. Now we're going to talk about our second requirement, a bargain for exchange of the parties. Okay, we need to have mutuality here. Both parties are going to have to contribute something. Both parties have to provide consideration. Let's go back to a second to my mom who's providing me with the Monet. Let's assume she didn't expect me to provide anything. She doesn't expect me to give up bubble gum. She doesn't expect me to provide finger paintings for my children. She's just going to give me the painting. Well, she's certainly done something that's detrimental to her. So we've satisfied the first requirement. She has a detriment. She's also provided something that's a benefit to me, so she's satisfied that as well. But the problem is that there's not been any bargaining. I'm not putting anything into the mix here, and so therefore there's no mutuality. What does mutuality mean? And we saw this in mutuality of assent in chapter 5 that we discussed, but here's a little refresher on that. Mutuality, it's two persons having the same relationship toward each other with respect to a particular right, obligation, burden, or benefit. I don't love this definition. For one thing, it doesn't have to be two persons. You can have more than two people in a contract. Typically, the consideration isn't going to be exactly the same. I mean, I'm not going to provide a priceless Monet to my mom, and she's not going to provide a priceless Monet back to me. One of us is likely to be giving, money or service, and then the other person giving something else. So it's not exactly the same deal, but the parties have decided this is a good deal for themselves, and so they've decided to go this route. So the thing that we're focusing on here is that there's a give and take. There's a my mom says, I'm willing to give you this Monet painting in exchange for my grandchildren's finger painting. And I say, well, I don't really want that Monet painting. I'd like that Monet painting over there. Maybe I'd like the Chagall painting over there. And then maybe my mother says, well, I would like then 2 finger paintings from each one of the children. That would be a bargain for process. So we're looking at the fact that we need at least one promise in a contract. There has to be a promise. When there is only one promise in a contract, we call it a unilateral promise. Again, that's the way I remember this is a unilateral is like a unicycle, one wheel. And so a contract is a contract with a single promise. Most of the time, most contracts have 2 promises. So this would be unilateral contract. And then if we have a promise in exchange for a promise, we have a bilateral contract. Bilateral, bi as in bicycle, 2 wheels. Oops, here we go. So an example of a bilateral promise, going back to the promise that my mom says, hey, I promise to give you this Monet painting if you promise not to chew bubblegum for 30 days. If I agree to that, my mom's making a promise, Monet painting in 30 days, and I'm making a promise, no gum. So that's one way we could fashion the agreement. That would be a bilateral agreement, but it could also be a promise in exchange for a forbearance of an act. So my mom might instead say, I promise to give you this priceless money if you do not chew gum for the next 30 days. And I say to my mom at that point, okay, I accept that contract. I promise not to chew gum for 30 days. And my mom goes, no, wait a second. That's not what I said. What I said was, you need to act. I don't want your promise. I know you. You're going to sneak a piece of bubble gum. You're going to lie to me. Instead, I want you to just not do it. The way that you accept this contract is skipping the gum. And so the only way you can accept it is by not chewing the gum. You need to take an act, not make me a promise. So that's a unilateral contract. Both are perfectly good contracts. Both involve consideration. And here the consideration is the promise. And in these situations, the consideration is the act or the forbearance of an act. The word forbearance is not that common. So let's just do a little refresher on this one. To forbear means to refrain from doing or using something. For example, I forbear when in my example, when I decided not to use the gum, not to chew gum. So I am avoiding a particular action. Again, the act has to be a lawful act. Let's say I had a cocaine problem and my mom says, daughter, I will give you this priceless money if you will not use cocaine for the next 30 days. Well, and let's say I accept that. I say, I promise that I will not use cocaine for the next 30 days. And it's a big deal for me because let's say I'm addicted to cocaine. So I'm going to go through withdrawal. It's very, very difficult for me. At the end of the 30 days, my mom doesn't give me the Monet. I say, why not? She goes, well, guess what? You couldn't legally consume the cocaine. And so your actions to forbear or avoid usage wasn't consideration because you're not supposed to break the law. So forbear means to refrain from doing or using something. Note that this is not in the textbook, but you are responsible for it. This absolutely could be on a quiz. So here's an example of mutuality. Here we have boy is providing the frog and Sally is providing $5. That's the consideration both parties have in this particular example. So now we've completed the first two elements. We've talked about that consideration is a detriment or a benefit, or more likely both. And we've talked about the fact that it has to be a bargain for exchange between the parties. This next item, the one that requires that it be for value, we've kind of already talked about, but let's just do a little refresher. Here's the definition of value. The worth of a thing in money, material, services, or other things for which it may be exchanged. And again, we talked about that the court isn't going to be sitting back deciding, oh, well, guess what, that Monet painting's worth just a little bit more than Groover's children's finger painting. The court isn't going to be comparing. They're going to be saying, does the Monet inherently have value? Sure. Do Groover's children's finger painting inherently have value, at least in the opinion of the parties, in the subjective evaluation of the parties? Yep, sure does. So they have value. The court's not going to be saying, well, which one has more value? Are they pretty much the same? Court's not even going there. Okay, so the parties themselves decide on the value. They're the ones who get to calibrate it and say, we really like this, but we don't really value that. And these are, again, are examples of things that can have value. Money can have value, no big surprise there. Services can have value. Me painting your barn, you being an employee, me writing a will for somebody, me washing a car. All those things are services. Selling property, either personal property such as a car or a book, or real property such as land. And then, of course, the act of forbearance, my decision to not chew bubble gum. All those have value. And now we're going to talk about a promise between parties. I've kind of already talked about this. It's a little bit tied up with this idea. So giving up something in exchange for nothing creates a gift, not a contract. So it involves both parties contributing consideration. So if my mom gives me the Monet and she's not getting anything for me, it's a gift. Now, gifts are lovely things. I'm not here to say gifts are bad things. I like gifts. And once a gift is given, it is a legal transfer of title. So it has legal significance, but it's not a contract. Um, and before the gift is given, the recipient or the potential recipient's relationship with the item that's going to be given hasn't changed. So here's a definition of gift: a voluntary transfer of property by one person to another without any consideration or compensation. So you can see gift does not equal consideration. Here we have a Maserati. Very fancy, right? Let me just spell out Maserati in case you are curious how you would spell this. Maserati. By the way, they're Italian sports car, if you're not familiar with it. Maserati. That would be a lovely gift for somebody, definitely having consideration. Or, of course, it could be consideration in a contract if you aren't giving it as a gift. This is an example of something that could be a gift, or it could be consideration. So now we've talked about how consideration can be a benefit or detriment. It should be an exchange, a bargain for exchange between the parties of something of value that's a promise between the parties. And finally, we've already talked about this a little bit with my cocaine example, the value must be legal. So if I'm trying to sell the kid who keeps on crying, you can't sell kids. If I am selling cocaine, can't sell cocaine. If I am selling pirated items, let's say I happen to have a a pirated movie or song or CD or something like that, can't sell that. If I'm trying to sell beer to a minor, that's unlawful. Or selling cigarettes to a minor, that's unlawful. Prostitution, gambling, lots of things are unlawful, and those items, even if they involve great value, are not considered consideration. And that we'll talk more about a legal object as one of our other elements. Actually, let me flip back here. And this is one of the things that you'll see with these topics, is that many times a particular type of transaction will have multiple problems. So you can see that you could just, again, going back to my example where I am agreeing to forbear the use of cocaine, you could see that as a consideration problem, or you could see it as a legal object problem. So there's different ways sometimes of approaching different formation issues with contracts. So now we have completed all 5 of our elements of consideration. We have to have all 5 of these elements in order to have consideration. If we're missing just one of them, we don't have consideration. If we don't have consideration, we don't have one of our 4 elements of contracts, and we don't have a contract. So we need each one of these to have this, and we need this to have this, right? I've already mentioned this before, but just let me reiterate it for a second. The adequacy of consideration is almost never an issue. Courts aren't going to be saying, well, you only gave your kids lousy artwork for the Monet. That doesn't seem fair. The idea is that the court isn't going to be the nanny. If you're an adult who's entered into a contract, suck it up, buttercup. You need to fulfill your contractual obligations. If you negotiated a bad deal, do a better job next time. Learn from this mistake. So that's one reason that we don't care about the adequacy of considerations. Another reason is that sometimes contracts actually don't state the real consideration that's in play. They include some statement like this, that there was consideration of $10 and other valuable consideration. Maybe this is a deal that is going to be a public record, and they don't want to know what the price maybe of the house is that they're actually paying for, and so they include this language to make it not be, say, a public record, the exactual amount. And so that, again, that's not going to interfere with the binding nature of the contract, because even though the person might be buying a huge mansion for $10, according to the terms of the contract, it's a very lopsided deal, but the courts are going to be like, oh, $10, $10 million, same deal, both consideration, let's move on. Now, I say that courts don't usually consider the adequacy of consideration, and that's true, but as is the case with most of these areas of the law, unfortunately, is that we have a general rule and then we start looking for exceptions, because there are some exceptions to this. One can arise when there is a sham to the transaction, or at least there's a suspicion that there may be a sham to the transaction. I'll give you an example. Let's say that times are not so good for me and I am about to enter into or file for bankruptcy. If I file for bankruptcy, all of the assets that I have are going to be divided between, or not all of them, but the ones that are not protected by law are going to be divided up by my creditors. Let's say I happen to have that priceless Monet. I might say to you, hey, listen, buddy, I'm about to file for bankruptcy. This priceless Monet is worth $10 million. If I own it when I file for bankruptcy, then it's going to be sold at auction and I'm not going to get the value of that. But how about if I sell it to you the day before I file for bankruptcy and you give me $10 for it? And then once the whole bankruptcy is resolved, I'll give you back your $10 and you'll give me back the Monet. And I'll get to keep the Monet. My creditors won't get it. And I will also get all the bankruptcy release. You can see how that could be a scam. I mean, I'm trusting that you aren't going to just keep the Monet. I mean, there has to be some trust there. But let's say we're really good friends. And so you can see how under those circumstances, the court might be suspicious about me getting only $10 from Monet, especially if it's right before I'm filing for bankruptcy. Another situation would be the mutuality of assent that we talked about. A little refresher here. This category right here. Sometimes when there's inadequate consideration, it's a sign that we have one of these 6 problems. Either there was fraud, or there was duress, or there was misrepresentation, or undue influence, or mistake, or especially unconscionability. But all these others can also apply. Again, if a gun was put to my head, yeah, I'd be willing to sell my priceless Monet for $10, sure. And so these can be in play, but you need more to prove these claims than adequacy of consideration. You need some facts. But a really lopsided amount of consideration between the parties is one piece of the puzzle, in addition to others, that could persuade the court to rule that there is no contract. Again, not so much because of a lack of consideration, but more because of this issue, the lack of mutuality of assent. Again, the purpose of consideration isn't so much to persuade the court that this is a fair deal, but it's just usually to demonstrate that there was, in fact, a contract in existence. So here we go. Again, this is our structure of how we're looking at contract law. We have 4 elements: agreement, consideration, legal capacity, and legal object. We need to have all 4 of these in order to have a contract. Under the category of consideration, we have 5 elements to it. We need each one of these elements to be present in order to have consideration. And if we are missing one of these elements, we don't have consideration, and therefore we don't have a contract. Again, the elements are: consideration has to involve a detriment or a benefit, or both. It has to be a bargain for exchange between the parties. And it has to be for something of value, at least of value to the parties. There has to be a promise between the parties. Both parties are contributing a promise. And of course, the value must be legal. If we're missing any of these, we don't have consideration and we don't have a contract. So at this point, we're done with the elements of contract. In our next lecture, we'll talk about some situations that aren't counting as consideration. As always, if you have questions about the material that we're covering, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Ooh, went too far. Either email me or give me a call, or come to my office hours and we can talk at length to hopefully make a little bit more clarity about what we're talking about when we talk about this topic. As always, I thank you for your attention. I hope that this has been valuable for you, and have a wonderful day. And watch the second lecture. Take care. Bye-bye.